The heavy oak door of my office was closed, shutting out the hum of the construction yard outside. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a day like any other in the 54 years I had spent building my life from the dirt up. Then the phone on my mahogany desk rang. I picked it up expecting it to be a supplier or one of my foremen. Instead, it was Dr. Warren Mitchell. His voice was unnervingly calm, the kind of clinical tone that immediately makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He cleared his throat. "Jim," he said, his words slow and measured. "I have the results of the bone marrow match test for Bradley." I leaned forward, my heart pounding against my ribs. I was 71 years old, but I was ready to go under the knife, ready to give my 45-year-old son whatever he needed to survive. But the doctor did not talk about surgery schedules or white blood cell counts. Instead, he dropped a sentence that would completely obliterate my reality. "Jim, there is a biological impossibility here," the doctor said. The silence stretched for a terrifying second. "You do not carry his paternal DNA. Jim, you are not Bradley's biological father. If you are listening to this right now, take a deep breath. Because what I am about to tell you is the story of a man who worked his fingers to the bone for half a century only to discover his entire existence was a manufactured lie. If you have ever been betrayed by your own blood or by the people you sacrificed everything for, please hit the like button and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It gives me strength to know I am not speaking into the void." The phone slipped from my grip. It hit the polished surface of the desk with a heavy, hollow thud. I did not pick it up. I could faintly hear Dr. Mitchell calling my name through the receiver, his voice tiny and distorted, like a ghost trapped in a plastic box. "Jim. Are you there, Jim?" I stared at my hands. They were resting flat on the desk, trembling violently. I looked at the thick, calloused skin, the scars across my knuckles from decades of handling raw rebar and pouring concrete. These were the hands of a man who had breathed in toxic fiberglass dust and frozen in the bitter Pennsylvania winters to build a $22 million commercial construction empire. Every cracked nail, every aching joint in my 71-year-old body was a testament to the sacrifices I had made for my family. I closed my eyes and the memories rushed in, uninvited and suffocating. I remembered the year Bradley was born. I was working double shifts at a steel mill, coming home with my muscles screaming in agony just to afford the mortgage on our first tiny house. I remembered holding him in the hospital nursery, looking through the glass and promising that tiny red-faced infant that he would never have to struggle the way I did. I remembered paying for his expensive private schools, buying his first car, and funding his lavish wedding. I remembered the pride I felt watching him walk across the stage to get his college diploma, thinking to myself that all the sweat, all the missing cartilage in my knees, all the days I worked through pneumonia were absolutely worth it, because I was building a legacy for my son. But as I sat there, the air in my office suddenly felt as thick as wet cement. The man lying in that hospital bed, the man I was prepared to let doctors drill into my bones for, did not have a drop of my blood in his veins. The realization did not just break my heart, it violated my soul. It felt as if an invisible intruder had walked into my mind and violently ripped out 54 years of my identity. I was not a father. I was a host. I was a bank account with a pulse. I slowly stood up. My knees popped a familiar ache that suddenly felt entirely pointless. I walked over to the large glass window of my executive office. Down below, dozens of heavy trucks were moving across the yard, carrying steel beams and pallets of cement. They all had my last name painted on the side in bold blue letters. Lawson Construction. I had built all of this for them. For Derek, my eldest. For Melissa, my daughter. For Bradley. I had spent my entire youth, my middle age, and my twilight years chasing a financial security that I blindly handed over to strangers. A cold, terrifying numbness began to spread through my chest, replacing the shock. It was a blue-collar survival instinct, the same cold logic that kicks in when a steel beam falls on a job site, and you have to act fast to stop the bleeding. I walked back to my desk and looked at the framed silver anniversary photo of my wife Cynthia. She was smiling, her eyes bright, her hand resting lovingly on my shoulder. We had met when we were teenagers. We had been married for 54 years. She was the only woman I had ever touched, the only woman I had ever loved. She was the one who had handed me Bradley in the hospital room, crying tears of joy, telling me he had my eyes. The sheer scale of her deception was monstrous. It was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a daily, calculated lie sustained over 4.5 decades. Every morning she kissed me goodbye. Every evening she welcomed me home. She knew. She knew the boy calling me Dad was a living, breathing fraud. I reached out and laid the picture frame face down on the wood. I did not cry. Crying was for men who had lost something. I had not lost anything. I had been robbed. I picked up my keys from the desk. I did not call the hospital back. I did not rush to Bradley's bedside to demand answers from a sick man. He might not have even known. But there was one person who knew exactly what had happened. I walked out of my office past my confused secretary and stepped out into the harsh afternoon sun. The smell of diesel fuel and hot asphalt filled the air, a smell that had defined my entire life. I climbed into the cab of my heavy-duty pickup truck and started the engine. The roar of the motor was the only sound that made sense to me in that moment. I pulled out of the company gates, my jaw set so hard my teeth ached. I was not driving to the hospital. I was driving back to my sprawling gated estate in the suburbs. I was driving back to the pristine, quiet house that my blood, sweat, and broken bones had paid for. And I was going to look the woman I had slept next to for 54 years, dead in the eyes, and I was going to watch her world burn. I drove through the wrought iron gates of my estate. The tires of my heavy truck crunched loudly against the long gravel driveway. The house stood before me, a massive colonial structure with perfectly manicured lawns and bright windows. It was a monument to my success, a secure fortress I had built to keep my family safe from the harshness of the outside world. Now it just looked like a giant vault holding a 54-year-old lie. I parked the truck and sat in the quiet cab for a long moment. My chest felt incredibly hollow. I took a deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow down. I grabbed the medical envelope from the passenger seat and walked up the front steps. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, filled with the soft hum of the central air conditioning and the faint smell of expensive lavender candles. I walked down the long hallway, my heavy work boots thudding against the imported hardwood floors. I found Cynthia in the kitchen. She was standing by the massive granite island, pouring herself a glass of red wine. She looked up and smiled, that same warm, familiar smile that had anchored my entire life. She was wearing a silk blouse, her hair perfectly styled. She looked comfortable. She looked safe. "Honey, you are home early," she said, taking a sip from her glass. "How is Bradley doing? Did Dr. Mitchell call you about the bone marrow match?" I did not say a single word. I walked straight up to the island and threw the crumpled lab results onto the polished granite. The papers slid across the smooth stone and stopped right in front of her. "Read it," I said. My voice was dangerously low, stripped of all emotion. Cynthia looked at me, her brow furrowing in confusion. She set her wineglass down and picked up the papers. I watched her eyes scan the medical jargon. I watched the exact moment her brain registered the words biological impossibility and zero paternal match. The color drained from her face in an instant, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. Her hands began to shake violently. The papers fluttered in her grip. She stumbled backward, bumping into the counter. Her elbow knocked the wineglass over. It shattered against the tile floor, sending a splash of dark red liquid across the pristine white cabinets like a crime scene. "Jim," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can explain." Then the tears came. Not just a few quiet drops, but an immediate weaponized flood of sobbing. She collapsed to her knees amidst the broken glass, burying her face in her hands. She wept with the kind of primal devastation that makes a man want to drop everything and comfort his wife. It was a masterclass in manipulation, but at that moment I just stood perfectly still and stared at her, waiting for the painful truth. "Stand up," I told her. "Just tell me the truth." Cynthia slowly looked up at me, her face streaked with dark mascara. She took a shuddering breath, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as if she were freezing. "Jim, you have to understand," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I did it for you. I did it for us. I did not move a single muscle. I just waited for the story to unfold." She wiped her eyes and leaned against the cabinets. "Do you remember the terrible accident?" she asked, her voice dropping to a raw whisper. "The scaffolding collapse at the downtown site in 1978, when you broke your pelvis and ruptured your internal organs." Of course I remembered. I spent 3 months in a hospital bed eating through a tube, wondering if I would ever walk again. She looked down at the floor. "The doctors pulled me aside while you were in surgery. They told me the trauma to your lower body was far too severe. They said the damage was permanent, Jim. They told me you would never be able to have children." My chest tightened. I remembered asking the doctors about it years later, and they had always been evasive, telling me it was a miracle I recovered as well as I did. "You were so incredibly proud, Jim," she cried, looking back up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "You were a strong, hard-working man who wanted a big family more than anything in the entire world. If I had told you that you were sterile, it would have destroyed your manhood. It would have broken your heart and shattered your spirit completely. I could not do that to you. I loved you too much to let you feel like a failure." So she took another deep breath, her tears flowing freely now. "I went to a private fertility clinic in the city, an anonymous sperm bank. I picked donors who shared your physical traits. I went through the painful procedures all by myself in secret just so I could give you the children you desperately dreamed of. I wanted you to be a father, Jim. I wanted to give you the family you rightfully deserved. I swear to you, on my very life, I never touched or looked at another man, not once. I only did this out of my pure and endless love for you." I stood there paralyzed by the weight of her sacrifice. A wave of immense guilt crashed over me. I had accused my devoted wife of betrayal, when she had actually carried a heartbreaking burden alone just to protect my pride. I stepped forward, pulling her into my arms, apologizing into her hair as she heavily sobbed against my chest. But later that night, lying awake in the dark bedroom, my sharp mind caught a fatal flaw. The scaffolding accident happened in 1978. Derek, our eldest son, was born in 1973. The timeline was a complete lie. The scaffolding accident happened in 1978. Derek, our eldest son, was born in 1973. The timeline was a complete lie. I stared at the dark ceiling of our bedroom, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the woman sleeping beside me. A normal man might have shaken her awake. A normal man might have turned on the lamps, screamed until his throat was raw, and demanded the truth right then and there. But I was not just a normal man. I was a survivor. When you spend your life on construction sites, you learn a fundamental rule of disaster. When the ground starts giving way beneath your boots, you do not panic. You do not make sudden movements. You freeze, you assess the structural damage, and you plan your escape route before the whole building collapses on top of you. I lay completely still in the dark. I did not close my eyes again. I let the cold, hard reality wash over me, hardening my heart like curing concrete. Cynthia had not gone to a clinic to protect my pride. She had gotten pregnant 5 years before I was ever injured. She had cheated on me, brought another man's child into my home, and then used my tragic accident as a convenient alibi decades later to cover her tracks. It was a level of deception so deep and so calculated that it terrified me. When the sun finally began to peek through the heavy curtains, I quietly rolled out of bed. I put on my boots, grabbed my hard hat, and left without a note. Driving to the construction yard that morning felt entirely different. The world looked sharper, colder. I pulled my truck into my reserved parking spot and walked into the main office building of Lawson Construction. For the first time in my life, I was not looking at my company as a proud father. I was looking at it through a new, chilling lens. I walked past the framed photographs on the wall, pictures of Derek, Melissa, and Bradley at various groundbreaking ceremonies. I had always looked at their faces and tried to see my own reflection. Now I saw the faces of strangers who were standing on the foundation I had built with my own broken bones. As I poured my morning coffee in the break room, I realized something even more disturbing. If Cynthia had lied about Derek, what else had she lied about? The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing into a twisted, poisonous vine. I needed to know everything, but I could not let them know that I was watching. The silent predator inside me had fully awakened. Later that morning, I stood on the second-floor balcony overlooking the main distribution warehouse. Below me, I saw Derek walking through the aisles with his wife, Natalie. Natalie had never worked a hard day in her life, but she carried herself as if she owned the entire fleet of trucks. I watched as Derek stopped Hector, a forklift driver, who had been with me for 20 years. Derek began yelling at him, waving a clipboard aggressively in Hector's face. Natalie stood beside him, crossing her arms and scoffing, her designer purse dangling from her wrist. I could not hear the exact words over the machinery, but the pure disdain on my son's face was unmistakable. He was humiliating a loyal employee for sport. A sickening realization hit me in the gut. I had raised an arrogant bully. Shortly after that, my office door swung open without a knock. Melissa breezed in, smelling of expensive perfume and carrying a shopping bag from a high-end boutique. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about Bradley's condition in the hospital. She walked straight to my desk and dropped a glossy brochure on top of my blueprints. "Dad, I need you to write a check to the foundation," she demanded, not even bothering to make eye contact. "It is for the charity gala next month. 50,000 should cover the sponsor table." I stared at her. She was 50 years old, living in a mansion I had purchased for her, and she was demanding $50,000 as casually as someone asking for a stick of gum. There was no please. There was no thank you. There was only an expectation of endless compliance. I silently wrote out the check. She snatched the paper off the desk, turned on her heel, and walked out without another word. I sat alone in my office, the silence ringing in my ears. I had spent my entire life trying to give my children the financial security I never had growing up. But in doing so, I had completely failed to give them a soul. I had raised entitled monsters who viewed me not as a father, but as a deeply convenient bank. And now, knowing that they might not even share my blood, their callous behavior felt like a physical knife twisting in my back. I decided right then that I was going to test all three of them. I waited patiently until the executive office suite completely cleared out for the lunch hour. I walked into Derek's empty corner workspace and secretly pocketed the unwashed ceramic coffee mug he had left sitting on his desk. Next, I slipped quietly into the executive washroom and retrieved Melissa's expensive hairbrush, carefully extracting the blonde strands tangled deep in the bristles. Finally, I went down to the company's secure medical records room and retrieved the old blood sample Bradley had submitted for a baseline insurance screening several years ago. I carefully sealed the 3 separate items in clear, airtight plastic bags. That afternoon, I drove to a rural post office 2 towns over and shipped the packages to 3 completely separate, out-of-state DNA testing laboratories. I sent them under a fake name to ensure secrecy. The 2 weeks that followed were an exercise in sheer psychological torture. Every morning I woke up next to a woman who had potentially orchestrated the greatest fraud of my life. I had to smile at her over coffee. I had to listen to her talk about her book club and the new landscaping she wanted for the backyard that I paid for, the landscaping that my sweat funded. I played the role of the loving, clueless patriarch with a terrifying perfection. It was a performance that would have won awards if anyone had been watching. Derek still strutted around the construction yard like a prince inheriting a kingdom. I sat in meetings with him listening to his arrogant proposals to cut employee benefits, all while staring at his face trying to find any trace of my own features. There were none. He had a weak jaw and a cruel slant to his eyes that belonged to someone else. Melissa continued to treat me like a personal bank. A few days after she demanded the charity check, she came back into my office to ask if I would cover a luxury vacation to Aspen for her and her friends. She claimed she needed to decompress from managing the family foundation. I smiled warmly, pulled out my checkbook, and wrote the amount she asked for. My hand did not shake. I handed it to her, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat as she snatched it away with a hollow thank you. And then there was Bradley. I visited him in the hospital playing the worried father. I sat by his bed holding the hand of a man who thought I was his flesh and blood. Did he know? Was he in on the lie? I could not tell. I just sat there listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, wondering whose heart was actually beating in his chest. I signed medical release forms and paid his exorbitant hospital bills without blinking. I was funding the survival of a stranger. Every dollar I spent felt like a mockery of my 54 years of hard labor. I kept telling myself to hold on to wait for the absolute proof before I tore down the walls of my own house. I needed the science. I needed the undeniable facts. The agonizing weight forced me to compartmentalize my rage, locking it away in a dark corner of my mind, where it slowly turned to ice. At night, Cynthia would rub my shoulders, telling me how stressed I looked. She whispered sweet words about how we would get through Bradley's illness together. I would nod, kissing her forehead, feeling physically sick as her lips brushed my skin. I was living inside a nightmare, trapped in a house made of secrets, smiling at the monsters who were slowly draining my life force. The days bled into one another, each one heavier than the last, until finally the silence was broken. It was a Thursday afternoon when the notifications finally chimed on my private computer. I was alone in my locked office at the construction yard. The heavy door was deadbolted. The blinds were drawn tight. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I opened the secure, encrypted emails from the 3 separate testing facilities. I took a deep breath, the air whistling through my teeth, and clicked on the first attachment. It was the report for Derek. The screen loaded, displaying rows of complex genetic markers. I scrolled straight to the bottom, looking for the conclusive summary. Probability of paternity 0%. My stomach dropped. I immediately clicked on the second email. Melissa's results. Again, the screen filled with data. Again, I scrolled to the bottom. Probability of paternity 0%. I was breathing heavily now, the cold reality settling deep into my bones. Finally, I opened the third email containing the comparison for Bradley's old blood sample. 0%. The sperm bank lie was dead. None of them were mine. But as I stared at the 3 open windows on my monitors, my eyes caught something else. I had paid extra for a comparative analysis between the 3 samples. I wanted to see if they were full siblings. I scrolled down to the cross-reference section of the reports. The words printed on the screen made my blood run completely cold. The subjects do not share a biological father. They are half-siblings, sharing only maternal DNA. I leaned back in my leather chair, the leather creaking loudly in the silent room. The gravity of what I was reading threatened to crush me. Cynthia had not gone to a sperm bank. She had not had a one-time affair in a moment of weakness. She was a serial cheater. For over a decade, during the hardest years of my life, while I was breaking my back to build our future, my wife was actively sleeping with different men. 3 children, 3 completely different fathers. She had systematically brought the offspring of strangers into my home and tricked me into loving them, raising them, and funding their lavish lives. It was an evil so profound, so calculating, that it defied all comprehension. She was a master manipulator who had played me for a fool since the day we said our vows. I stared at the glowing screens until my eyes burned. The truth was absolute. I was not a husband. I was not a father. I was just a walking ATM, a beast of burden meant to pull the plow for a family of parasites. The sadness was entirely gone now, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a prepaid burner phone, and punched in a number I had not called in 20 years. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Victor Thorne, a ruthless former FBI agent turned private investigator. It was time to go to war. I called Victor. He gave me an address for a dilapidated diner on the outskirts of the county, far away from the polished suburbs. I parked my heavy truck in the dimly lit lot, rain misting the windshield. Inside, the diner smelled of stale coffee and old grill grease. I found Victor sitting in a secluded back booth. He was a broad-shouldered man with sharp, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Sitting across from him was Benjamin Wright. Benjamin was a corporate lawyer known throughout the state for his absolute ruthlessness. He was a shark in a dark suit, the kind of man you hire to leave your enemies with nothing. I sat across from them without pleasantries. I reached into my jacket, pulled the 3 printed DNA reports from my pocket, and slid them across the sticky laminate table. Victor picked them up, his eyes scanning the raw data with the cold detachment of a man who had seen every ugly side of human nature. Benjamin simply watched my face. After a long minute, Victor set the papers down and let out a low whistle. 3 different fathers, he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. In my 30 years with the Federal Bureau, I have seen a lot of long cons, Jim. But this is a masterpiece of deception. Benjamin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, steepling his fingers. The emotional betrayal is devastating, Jim, he said, his tone entirely clinical and detached. But we need to look closely at the legal and financial reality. You have a $22 million empire. You have trusts, massive real estate holdings, and a heavy investment portfolio. Right now, by law, those 3 children are your legal heirs. If you drop dead tomorrow, the people who have been lying to you for half a century will inherit every single penny of your hard work. And if you simply walk into a courthouse and file for divorce, Cynthia will take half of everything you built before the ink even dries. I clenched my fists under the table until my knuckles turned white. I am not giving them a single dime, I said, my voice steady and freezing cold. I will burn the entire company to the ground before I let them profit off my sweat and blood. Benjamin smiled a thin, predatory smile. You do not need to burn it down, Jim. You just need to build a much better trap. But to do that, we need to know exactly what they are planning, and we need to know exactly who the real fathers are. Victor reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a small, foam-lined box. He slid it carefully across the table toward me. Inside were 3 tiny matte black discs, no larger than a standard dime. Military-grade micro-audio transmitters, Victor explained quietly. They are voice-activated, completely untraceable, and they transmit directly to a secure encrypted application on your phone. They have a continuous battery life of 6 months. I need you to put these where they feel the safest, where they talk when they think absolutely no one is listening to them. I took the box, the tiny devices feeling unnervingly heavy in my palm. The next day, I became a silent ghost haunting my own life. I started at the construction yard. During the busy lunch hour, when I knew Derek was out eating at a high-priced steakhouse, I slipped into his executive office. I felt a strange thrill of adrenaline as I reached under his heavy oak desk, pressing the adhesive side of the first bug right next to his private phone line. Later that afternoon, I drove to Melissa's sprawling house under the pretense of dropping off some urgent paperwork for the Family Charity Foundation. She was upstairs getting a massage. Her housekeeper let me in, and left me completely alone in the massive vaulted living room. I walked over to the towering stone fireplace I had paid to have custom built, and I slid the second bug deep behind a heavy decorative vase on the wooden mantel. Finally, I went back to my own estate, the place that was supposed to be my ultimate sanctuary. Cynthia was out attending a country club luncheon. I walked into our master bathroom. It was pristine, smelling strongly of her expensive imported perfumes. I knelt on the cold tile floor, feeling exactly like a thief breaking into a stranger's home. I reached far under her luxurious vanity, feeling the smooth, polished wood, until I found a recessed, hidden corner. I pressed the third bug firmly into place. I stood up slowly and looked at my reflection in the wide mirror. The man staring back at me looked 10 years older, his eyes hollowed out by total betrayal. But there was also a dangerous, unfamiliar spark there, a quiet, deadly resolve that had not existed yesterday. That night I told Cynthia I needed to run down to the local hardware store for some minor supplies. Instead, I drove a few blocks away and parked my truck in the deep shadows of a vacant commercial parking lot. I turned off the engine, the heavy silence of the cab pressing in on me from all sides. I pulled out my secure phone, plugged in my heavy noise-canceling headphones, and opened the application Victor had securely installed. The bright screen showed 3 active signals. I tapped the glass screen to synchronize the audio feeds. A faint burst of digital static hissed through the headphones, followed immediately by the crystal-clear sound of a ringing phone line. It was a 3-way conference call connecting my wife and her 3 adult children. I closed my eyes tightly, gripped the steering wheel, and listened. And what I heard in the next 5 minutes made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. The first voice that pierced the static was Derek. It was not the respectful, professional tone he used around the office when he needed me to sign off on a massive budget expansion. It was a sneering, arrogant drawl that sounded entirely foreign to me. "I am telling you, Mother," Derek said, the audio crisp and unforgiving in my ears. "The old man is never going to let go of the reins." I sat in on the quarterly projections today, and he vetoed my proposal to sell off the Eastern Division. He is 71 years old, for God's sake. He is living too long, and he is controlling the company too tightly. It is absolutely suffocating. A sharp sigh followed. It was Melissa. Her voice echoed slightly, likely pacing in her massive living room. "Derek is right, Mom," she whined, sounding exactly like the spoiled teenager I had unfortunately created. "He questioned me about the $50,000 check for the charity gala today. He actually looked at me like I was stealing from him. I am tired of having to beg for my own inheritance. We cannot just wait around for another 10 or 15 years for his heart to finally give out. He is too stubborn to just die naturally like a normal person." I sat in the dark cab of my truck, gripping the leather steering wheel so hard my hands went completely numb. These were the people I had bled for. I had sacrificed my youth, my joints, and my peace of mind to build an empire for them. I had paid for Derek to go to an Ivy League business school so he could sit in my office and complain that I was living too long. I had bought Melissa that multi-million-dollar house she was currently standing in, only for her to resent me for not dying fast enough. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement was nauseating. They did not view me as a human being. They viewed me as a malfunctioning vault that refused to open its doors. Then Cynthia spoke. Her voice was smooth, calm, and terrifyingly cold. It was the voice of a woman who had successfully lived a double life for over half a century. "You both need to calm down," she said, her tone authoritative and sharp. "You are acting like impatient children. I told you I have everything under control. We are not waiting for him to die. That was never the plan." The static hissed faintly as Derek let out a low chuckle. "I know, Mother, but the timeline is getting tight. Are you sure he is ready?" Cynthia sighed, the sound picking up clearly on the hidden microphone beneath her vanity. "I have been laying the groundwork for months," she said smoothly. "Have you not noticed how sluggish he has been lately? How he sometimes loses his train of thought during dinner?" I felt a sudden violent coldness wash over my entire body. I had noticed. For the past few months I had been feeling unusually tired. My head would occasionally feel thick and foggy, a heavy grogginess that I had simply chalked up to the stress of Bradley being in the hospital and my advancing age. I have been crushing mild prescription sedatives into his morning coffee and his evening tea, Cynthia confessed, her voice devoid of any guilt or hesitation. Just enough to slow his cognitive functions down. When the doctors examine him, the chemical residue will mimic the exact symptoms we need. He will seem confused, lethargic, and entirely incapable of managing his own affairs. I sat frozen in the shadows, my stomach churning violently. My own wife, the woman who had kissed my cheek every morning for 54 years, had been slowly and methodically poisoning me in my own home. Melissa chimed in, her voice buzzing with greedy anticipation. "So the hearing is still set for next Tuesday?" "Yes," Derek answered confidently. "I spoke with our attorney this afternoon. We are filing the petition for an involuntary conservatorship in probate court first thing Monday morning. The medical affidavits are already drafted. We are claiming he is suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia. Because of his vast corporate holdings and his sudden mental decline, the court will grant an emergency order. We will have full medical and financial power of attorney before the old man even realizes what day of the week it is." I stopped breathing. A conservatorship. It was the ultimate legal trap. They were not just trying to steal my money. They were trying to completely strip away my basic human rights. If a judge declared me legally incompetent, I would not be able to sign a contract, hire my own lawyer, or even decide where I wanted to live. I would be a prisoner in my own life, totally at the mercy of three people who secretly despised my very existence. The sheer wickedness of the plot was staggering. They had weaponized my age, my love, and my absolute trust completely against me. I felt entirely trapped. The conference call was wrapping up, the perpetrators satisfied with their flawless conspiracy. But before the line disconnected, Derek let out a dark, cruel laugh that echoed through my headphones and burned itself deep into my memory. The terrifying sound of his amusement sent another wave of revulsion straight through my chest. "It is going to be almost too easy," Derek said, his voice dripping with pure malice. "Once the judge signs the order next week, we dump the old man in that state-run nursing home out in the valley. The one that smells like bleach and boiled cabbage. Then we take the 22 million, liquidate the firm, and never have to look at his pathetic face ever again. Have a good night, Mother." I sat in the dark for a long time after the audio feed cut out. The heavy silence of the vacant parking lot pressed against the windows of my truck. My chest heaved with a mixture of profound grief and a newly ignited white-hot fury. The natural instinct of any man would have been to drive back to that sprawling estate, kick the front door off its hinges, and drag every single one of them out onto the street. But I was not just any man, I was a builder, and a builder knows that before you demolish a corrupted structure, you must first secure your own foundation. If I confronted them now with the hearing already set for next week, they would simply accelerate their plan. They would call the police, claim I was having a violent dementia-induced episode, and lock me away in a psychiatric ward before the sun even came up. No, I could not fight them with anger. I had to fight them with their own twisted narrative. I had to play the fool. The next morning, the performance of my life officially began. I walked down the grand staircase of my home, moving a little slower, letting my shoulders slump. When I entered the kitchen, Cynthia was pouring coffee. I stood in the doorway, staring blankly at the marble countertops. "Where did I leave my keys?" I asked, intentionally making my voice sound thin and uncertain. I patted my empty pockets. "I cannot seem to remember where I parked the truck last night." Cynthia turned around, a flicker of dark triumph flashing in her eyes, before she masked it with false sympathy. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed, walking over to pat my arm. "You parked it in the garage right where it always goes. Your memory is just slipping a little bit. Sit down and drink your coffee." I sat at the table swallowing the bitter brew I knew was laced with sedatives. That evening, during a family dinner with Derek and his wife Natalie, I took the act a step further. Halfway through the meal, I intentionally let my hand tremble. My heavy silver fork clattered loudly against the fine china plate, dropping a piece of steak onto the pristine tablecloth. Derek rolled his eyes in obvious disgust. I looked at him, blinking slowly. "The weather is unpredictable," I muttered, repeating the exact same sentence I had spoken only 10 minutes earlier. "Has anyone noticed the weather lately?" Derek practically sneered, throwing his napkin onto the table. "We already talked about the weather, Dad." "Jesus, pay attention." I lowered my head, playing the role of the broken old man perfectly. But observing their cruelty up close without the filter of a father's blind love was agonizing. It was a daily psychological torture. Because they believed my brain was rapidly rotting, they stopped hiding their true nature. They became brazen. The very next afternoon, I walked into my private study to find Natalie rummaging through my mahogany bookshelves. She had a large cardboard box resting on my leather reading chair. Inside it, I saw my favorite books. These were first editions of history and philosophy texts I had spent decades collecting, books I cherished. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice frail. Natalie did not even bother to look over her shoulder. She just tossed another heavy volume into the box. "Oh, you never read these anymore, Jim. They are just gathering dust and making the room look cluttered. I am donating them to make space for some modern decor. You will not even notice they are gone." She was throwing away my history right in front of my face, stripping away my identity piece by piece. And Cynthia was far worse. My wife of 54 years grew so confident in my supposed mental decline that she no longer bothered to hide her infidelities. One evening, we were sitting together in the living room. I was staring blankly at the television, playing my part. Cynthia was sitting on the adjacent sofa, deeply engrossed in her phone. I watched from the corner of my eye as she smiled a youthful, flirtatious smile. She started recording a voice message. "I cannot wait to see you on Thursday," she purred softly into the microphone, her tone dripping with suggestion. The old man is basically a ghost these days. He has no idea what is going on. "I will wear that blue dress you like." She sent the message right in front of me in the house I paid for, confident that the man sitting 10 feet away was too far gone to comprehend her betrayal. My nails dug into the palms of my hands until they bled, but I did not break character. I just kept staring at the television, locking the rage deep inside my chest. I needed more evidence of their financial crimes before the trap could be sprung. The following day, I shuffled into Derek's executive office at the construction yard, pretending to look for a misplaced file. Derek was sitting behind his massive desk, furiously typing on his laptop. He glared. "What do you want, Dad?" "I am busy." I stepped forward, feigning a stumble, and intentionally crashed into the heavy metal filing cabinet next to his desk. The impact sent a stack of loose folders cascading to the floor. Derek cursed loudly, standing up to yell at me for being a clumsy old fool. While he was screaming, I dropped to my knees, pretending to helplessly gather the scattered papers. But my eyes were sharp. Underneath his desk, partially hidden by a leather wastebasket, was a document that had not fallen from the cabinet. It was a thick, printed bank statement from a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I slipped it up my sleeve as I apologized profusely. Later, in the safety of my truck, I opened the folded paper. The numbers simply did not add up. I stared at the crumpled offshore statement in the dim light of my truck cab. Millions of dollars were flowing in and out of an account I had never authorized under a corporate subsidiary I had never heard of. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I folded the paper carefully, slipping it deep into the inner pocket of my jacket. I could not go back inside the office. I could not look Derek in the eye, not yet. Instead, I drove straight to the outskirts of town, back to the dingy diner where Victor Thorne was waiting. I handed him the document across the sticky table. Victor studied the numbers, his expression darkening with every passing second. He did not say a word, but he pulled out his phone and made a quiet, urgent call to Benjamin Wright. Within an hour, we had assembled a shadow team. We hired an independent forensic accountant, a man who specialized in dissecting complex corporate fraud, to quietly rip through the financial veins of my company. I had to grant him backdoor access to the server logging in late at night from my home office, while Cynthia slept down the hall blissfully unaware that I was dismantling her entire world. The process took 3 agonizing days. 3 days of playing the doddering old man spilling my tea and pretending not to understand simple conversations, all while my secret team combed through decades of ledgers, shell companies, and phantom invoices. The waiting was a different kind of torture. I knew they were stealing from me, but I did not yet understand the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. On the morning of the 4th day, Victor called an emergency meeting. We met in a secure conference room downtown, far from anyone who might recognize me. When I walked in, Benjamin and the forensic accountant were already there, surrounded by stacks of printed ledgers and heavily redacted bank records. The accountant looked up at me, his face pale and serious. "Jim," he said, sliding a thick binder across the polished mahogany table. "I have seen corporate embezzlement before, but this is entirely different. Your children are not just skimming profits off the top. They are running a highly sophisticated washing machine." I sat down heavily in the leather chair. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor leaned forward, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Derek and Melissa have been using your commercial construction contracts to launder money for a local organized crime syndicate," Victor explained. "They have been inflating the cost of raw materials, creating phantom subcontractors, and pushing millions of dollars in dirty cash through your payroll and equipment leases. Once the money is clean, it is funneled out into a web of offshore accounts, including the one you found under Derek's desk." The room started to spin. They were not just greedy. They were hardened federal criminals. Benjamin adjusted his glasses, his expression grim. "This completely changes the motive for the conservatorship, Jim," he said softly. "They do not just want to control your $22 million estate. They are terrified of an impending federal audit. The IRS and the FBI have been cracking down on construction fraud in this state. If the authorities raid the company, your signature is on all the foundational documents. By declaring you mentally incompetent with rapid onset dementia, they are creating the perfect scapegoat. When the federal agents come knocking, Derek and Melissa will claim they were just trying to manage a failing company while their father lost his mind and made catastrophic illegal financial errors. They are going to let you take the fall and die in a federal prison hospital while they walk away with millions." I felt the air completely leave my lungs as the sheer gravity of their wickedness settled over me. My own children were setting me up to take the fall for a massive criminal enterprise. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom and my life just to save their own skin. I stared blankly at the stacks of paper on the table, feeling a cold, suffocating dread spreading through my chest. The betrayal was so profound that it physically hurt to breathe. Every single sacrifice I had made for them was just another tool they were using to dig my grave. I looked at Benjamin, my vision blurring, for just a fraction of a second before I forced the tears back down. I had spent 54 years building an empire to protect my family from the cold realities of the world. I had sheltered them from poverty, from struggle, from every hardship I had faced as a young man. And their gratitude was to wrap my life's work around my neck like a heavy iron chain and kick me into the deep waters of a federal prison. But Victor was not finished. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid one final thin folder across the polished wood toward me. As I tracked the offshore disbursements, I noticed a very strange pattern, Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. A significant portion of the cleaned money is not staying in the Cayman Islands. It is being regularly routed back into the States, specifically into a private medical holding company. I slowly opened the folder, my hands trembling slightly, despite my best efforts to keep them perfectly still. Inside was a corporate registry document for an upscale private fertility and oncology clinic located just outside the city limits. I scanned the long list of executive officers looking for any name I might recognize. My eyes stopped near the bottom of the page, and my blood ran completely cold. The primary owner and chief medical director was a name that burned itself into my retinas. It was Dr. Warren Mitchell, the exact same doctor who had called me on Tuesday to tell me I was not Bradley's father. I stared at the name printed on the corporate registry, the letters blurring as a wave of absolute nausea washed over me. Dr. Warren Mitchell. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to violently snap together, forming a picture so grotesque I could barely comprehend it. Victor did not waste a single second. As soon as we saw the name on the clinic's financial records, he initiated a covert operation to secure a DNA sample from the good doctor. Mitchell was a wealthy, arrogant man who frequented a high-end country club on the north side of the city. Victor trailed him there the very next morning. He sat 2 tables away on the outdoor patio sipping iced tea while Mitchell enjoyed an expensive breakfast. When Mitchell left his table to take a phone call, leaving behind a half-eaten grapefruit and a linen napkin he had used to wipe his mouth, Victor moved with the practiced invisibility of a former federal agent. He secured the napkin in an airtight evidence bag and sent it to the same secure laboratory we had used before paying for an expedited turnaround. I spent that entire day in a state of suspended animation. I went through the motions at the construction yard signing delivery manifests and nodding at my foreman, all while a storm of anticipation raged inside my chest. I drove to the hospital that evening to visit Bradley, forcing myself to walk into his private suite. And there, standing at the foot of the bed with his clipboard in hand, was Dr. Mitchell. He looked up and gave me a warm, sympathetic smile, playing the role of the dedicated family physician to absolute perfection. "Jim, it is good to see you," Mitchell said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Bradley is resting comfortably. We are still exploring alternative options for the transplant." I looked him dead in the eyes, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had to summon every ounce of willpower I possessed, not to wrap my hands around his throat right then and there. I nodded slowly, thanking him for his incredible dedication to my family. I walked out of that hospital room feeling like my skin was crawling. The next afternoon, the encrypted email arrived from the laboratory. I sat in my locked home office, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. I clicked the attachment. The comparison was laid out in stark, undeniable black and white. Probability of paternity between Dr. Warren Mitchell and Bradley Lawson was 99.9%. It was an absolute match. I leaned back in my leather chair, the breath leaving my lungs in a long, ragged exhale. The horrifying pieces of the puzzle locked firmly into place. The phone call I had received on Tuesday, the call that shattered my entire universe, had not been a medical courtesy. It had been a desperate act of damage control. Mitchell was Bradley's biological father. He knew that if I proceeded with the standard hospital screening for the bone marrow donation, the routine genetic testing would inevitably flag the lack of a paternal match. A random hospital technician would have entered that anomaly into the official medical record, and the secret would have exploded into the open. Mitchell intercepted the blood work and called me personally to deliver the news in a controlled environment, spinning it as a tragic medical impossibility before I could ever get on an operating table. He intentionally disqualified me to protect himself and Cynthia. But the betrayal ran deeper than a covered-up pregnancy. It was entirely about the money. Now I understood exactly where a massive portion of that cash was going. Cynthia and Mitchell were active long-term financial co-conspirators. For years, Cynthia had been using her position as my trusted wife to quietly approve inflated medical insurance claims and direct corporate health subsidies right into Mitchell's private clinic. They had been bleeding my construction empire dry, funneling the profits of my broken back into their own secret enterprise. My wife had slept with another man, brought his child into my home, and spent the next 45 years secretly financing her lover's extravagant lifestyle using my checkbook. They had looked me in the eye every single day, smiling warmly, while systematically destroying my legacy from the inside. I remembered pouring him expensive scotch in my own living room, laughing at his jokes, and thanking him for taking excellent care of my family's health. He had stood in my house secretly knowing the boy playing on the rug was his own flesh and blood. They viewed me as nothing more than a convenient beast of burden. They had meticulously constructed a golden cage around me, keeping me sedated with the illusion of a happy family, while they continuously harvested the fruits of my endless labor. One father was down. The mystery of Bradley's parentage was completely solved. But there were still two massive questions left completely unanswered. Who were the men that had fathered Derek and Melissa? Just as I stood up to pour myself a stiff drink, my private burner phone vibrated aggressively on the desk. I picked it up, my hands remarkably steady, despite the cold adrenaline coursing through my tired veins. It was Victor. His voice sounded tight, lacking its usual calm, detached professionalism. Jim, Victor said, the tension in his words immediately putting me on high alert. We just got the results back from the second round of investigation. I found Melissa's biological father. I froze the glass of amber liquid hovering inches from my mouth. Tell me, I said, my voice cold and flat. Victor let out a long, heavy sigh over the line. Jim, he warned softly, you are going to want to sit down for this one. He is someone you know very well. I took a deep breath, trying to brace myself for whatever devastating blow was about to come next. His name is Gary Hobbs. Victor said the words cutting through the tense silence of the phone line like a jagged blade. I gripped the edge of my desk so hard, my knuckles turned a bruised shade of purple. Gary Hobbs. Out of all the names in the world, that one was a ghost I thought I had buried 3 decades ago. I closed my eyes, and the memories came flooding back with sickening clarity. 30 years ago, Gary Hobbs was a very slick, fast-talking, and manipulative subcontractor I had hired to manage the electrical work on a massive commercial high-rise project downtown. He was a charismatic guy, the kind who always had a joke ready and a heavy pour of whiskey for anyone willing to listen. But beneath the charm, he was a rat. I caught him inflating invoices using substandard materials and pocketing the difference to fund his gambling addiction. He was embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars right from under my nose, jeopardizing the safety of the entire building. When I found out, I did not just fire him. I personally handed the evidence over to the district attorney and testified against him in court. I watched the judge sentence him to 5 years in a state penitentiary. He looked at me across the crowded courtroom that very day and swore loudly that he would make me pay. I had completely forgotten about him the very moment the heavy iron prison doors slammed shut. I thought I had won. But as Victor's words echoed in my ear, I realized Gary Hobbs had executed his revenge in the most insidious way imaginable. While I was busy building my company and sending him to prison, he was sleeping in my bed. He was whispering in my wife's ear. He was planting his seed in my home. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. Are you absolutely certain, Victor? I asked, my voice cracking slightly under the immense weight of the revelation. Yes, Victor replied firmly. I matched the DNA from Melissa's hairbrush to a profile Gary submitted to a state database a few years ago for a parole violation. It is an undeniable 100% match. I lowered the phone from my ear for a moment, staring blankly at the dark wood of my desk. Melissa, my only daughter. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the teenager whose extravagant sweet 16 I had paid for the woman who currently managed my family's charitable foundation. She was the biological spawn of the very man who had tried to bankrupt me. I picked the phone back up. Where is Gary Hobbs now? I asked, the cold numbness returning to my voice. He is living in a dilapidated trailer park on the south side of town, Victor said. He has not held a steady job since he got out of prison. But Jim, that is not the worst part. Victor paused, letting the heavy silence build before delivering the next crushing blow. I traced the financial records from the charity foundation Melissa manages. He continued, his tone turning grim. She has been quietly funneling tens of thousands of dollars every single month to a shell corporation registered under Gary's sister's name. She is using your money to support him. The absolute disrespect was staggering. Cynthia had not just cheated on me. She had chosen my worst enemy. She had taken the man who tried to destroy my livelihood, welcomed him into our marriage, and then forced me to raise his child. And now that same child was secretly draining the wealth I had built from my blood and sweat to financially support the deadbeat thief I had thrown in jail. I had spent 30 years proudly believing I had protected my company from Gary Hobbs, oblivious to the fact that he was effectively living on my payroll the entire time. I thought about Melissa's haughty attitude, her constant demands for expensive vacations, her complete lack of gratitude. She had inherited her father's arrogant, thieving nature, perfectly masked by the luxurious lifestyle I had blindly provided for her. They had turned me into a host for their parasitic existence. I was a man who prided himself on control, on knowing exactly where every nail was driven and every dollar was spent. Yet my own home had been a den of vipers for half a century. I told Victor to compile everything into the master file and hung up the phone. I poured the glass of amber liquid down the sink. I did not need alcohol. I needed a clear head for the slaughter that was coming. 2 fathers exposed. 2 massive pieces of the conspiracy locked into place. Dr. Warren Mitchell and Gary Hobbs. The betrayal was already so deep, it was almost incomprehensible. But there was still one missing piece. Derek, my eldest son. The man who sat in my office and confidently plotted to declare me legally incompetent. The mastermind behind the money laundering operation. I waited in the dark for 3 more excruciating days, playing the confused old man while my soul burned with righteous vengeance. On Friday evening, Victor did not call. He showed up unannounced at the dark diner where we held our secret meetings. When I walked into the dimly lit back booth, I immediately noticed a drastic change in his demeanor. Victor Thorne, a man who had faced down armed cartel members without blinking, looked visibly terrified. His hands were actually shaking as he pulled a thin, unmarked manila folder from his leather briefcase. He slid it across the sticky table but kept his hand pressed firmly on top of it, locking his eyes onto mine. Jim, Victor whispered, his voice trembling with genuine fear. I found out who Derek's biological father is. But if this third man is involved in their plot, you might not make it out of that courtroom alive. Victor's hands trembled as he kept them pressed firmly on the manila folder. I had never seen a man like Victor show genuine fear. I sat perfectly still in the dimly lit booth of the diner, the stale smell of old coffee hanging heavy in the air between us. Tell me, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Victor swallowed hard, sliding his hand off the cardboard. He opened the file and pushed a single sheet of paper toward me. I looked down. The name at the top of the official laboratory report was printed in bold, crisp ink. Thomas Caldwell. I stared at the letters, my mind struggling to process the information. It took a few agonizing seconds for the gravity of that name to fully register. Thomas Caldwell was not just a random man in the city. He was a highly respected, deeply connected, and notoriously ruthless figure in the local legal community. He was Judge Thomas Caldwell. I leaned back against the cracked vinyl of the booth, the air completely leaving my lungs. Derek, my eldest son, the heir apparent to my entire construction empire. The man who strutted around my offices, treating my loyal workers like dirt, was the biological son of a sitting judge. Cynthia had not just been sleeping around with random men. She had entangled herself with some of the most powerful and dangerous individuals in the county. Suddenly, Derek's arrogant demeanor, his endless sense of entitlement, and his cruel, calculating nature made perfect, terrifying sense. He had not inherited any of those traits from me. He was the mirror image of a man who spent his life looking down on people from a raised wooden bench. I closed my eyes, a sickening wave of revulsion washing over my tired body. I remembered attending high society charity dinners years ago with Cynthia by my side, smiling politely as she shook hands with Caldwell. I had stood right there, completely oblivious, wearing a tuxedo I bought with the money I made breaking my back, while she exchanged pleasantries with the man who had secretly fathered my firstborn child. I had paid for Derek to attend an elite business school, thinking I was giving my son the advantages I never had. Instead, I was raising Caldwell's bastard with my own sweat. The humiliation burned deep in my chest, a searing pain that threatened to consume me. I had been playing a rigged game since the beginning, but Victor was not finished speaking. The identity of Derek's father was just the beginning of the nightmare. The real horror was yet to come. I looked across the table at Victor, noticing how pale his face had become. His eyes darted nervously toward the diner entrance, as if he expected the police to kick the doors open at any given second. Jim, Victor whispered, his voice barely audible over the humming refrigerator. Please turn to the next page. I reached across the sticky table and turned the page of the file. It was a copy of the official court docket for the probate hearing scheduled for next Tuesday. My name was highlighted in bright yellow ink. James Lawson, petition for involuntary conservatorship. I scanned across the row to the column listing the presiding judicial officer. The printed text hit me with the physical force of a swinging sledgehammer. Presiding Judge Thomas Caldwell. The nightmare scenario had materialized before my eyes. The entire system was completely rigged. This was not just a greedy family stealing my fortune. This was a highly organized criminal conspiracy functioning at the highest levels of local government. Judge Caldwell was the exact probate judge assigned to rule on my mental competency. I stared at the docket, the sickening reality of their plan unfolding in my mind with terrifying clarity. Derek and Cynthia had not just blindly chosen a court. They had actively manipulated the legal filing system to ensure the case landed directly on Caldwell's desk. The judge was going to legally enslave me. He was going to bang his wooden gavel, declare me suffering from rapid onset dementia, and hand total control of my life, my medical decisions, and my $22 million empire directly to his own biological son. And it was not just about protecting his bastard child. It was about protecting his own personal cut of the stolen money. The forensic audit had shown millions of dollars being washed through my construction company and routed offshore. A corrupt judge with an expensive lifestyle needed a reliable way to clean his dirty kickbacks. Derek was his dedicated launderer. If the federal authorities raided my company, Caldwell would be deeply implicated. They needed a legally incompetent scapegoat, and they had spent months drugging my coffee to make sure I fit the profile perfectly. I was trapped in a closed loop of corruption. The man who was supposed to be the impartial arbiter of justice was pulling the strings of my execution. He would strip my human rights to hide his financial crimes. I felt a cold, suffocating panic rise in my throat. We cannot win this, Victor said, his voice laced with defeat. He holds all the power, Jim. He can reject our evidence and order you committed to a psychiatric facility before you finish your sentence. We are completely outmatched. Benjamin Wright slid out of the booth, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. Jim, you need to listen to me very carefully, Benjamin urged, his professional detachment entirely gone. You have to flee the country, right now. Take whatever liquid cash you can securely carry, get on a plane tonight, and disappear. If you walk into that courtroom on Tuesday, you will never see the outside world again. I looked at the lawyer. I looked at Victor. Then I slowly shook my head. I built this house, I growled, my voice cold. I will burn it down with them inside. The next morning, the counter-offensive officially began. I walked into the construction yard with a heavy heart, but a completely clear mind. I knew that the moment Judge Caldwell signed that conservatorship order on Tuesday, my signature would become legally worthless. I had less than 96 hours to dismantle the financial foundation of my own life. I called Benjamin Wright from my secure burner phone and gave him the absolute green light to execute the nuclear option. We initiated a massive covert liquidation of every single legitimate asset I fully controlled. I sold off my vast commercial real estate holdings, liquidated my heavy investment portfolios, and emptied out my private savings accounts. Because I was still the sole legal owner and acting chief executive of Lawson Construction, I had the unilateral authority to move capital without asking for permission from my arrogant son. Within 48 hours, Benjamin had successfully untangled $15 million in clean, legally obtained money from the company ledgers. But I was not going to hide it in a mattress, and I certainly was not going to let Cynthia or her bastard children touch a single penny of it. We established a complex, irrevocable offshore trust based in an impenetrable financial jurisdiction. Once the money crossed that border, it belonged entirely to the trust, untouchable by any American probate court or corrupt local judge. When it came time to name the beneficiaries, I did not hesitate for a single second. I listed Hector, the forklift driver Derek had humiliated. I listed my loyal foremen, the mechanics who worked late to keep our fleets running, and the hard-working men who had poured concrete alongside me for decades. They were my true family. They were the ones who actually built the empire. I was securing their retirements, ensuring that my legacy would protect the working-class men who truly deserved it, rather than the wealthy parasites who had spent half a century bleeding me completely dry. The remaining $7 million of the company value was hopelessly tangled in Derek's illegal shell corporations and money laundering operations. I left that dirty money exactly where it was. It was going to be the perfect bait for the trap. I signed the final transfer documents in the dark of my office, watching my net worth drop to almost nothing. It was the most liberating feeling I had ever experienced. I was a poor man again, but I was finally free. With the clean money securely locked away, it was time to address the dirty money. Late Sunday night, Victor drove me to a desolate underground parking garage located deep beneath a federal building in the city. The air was cold and smelled of damp concrete. We stood next to Victor's idling car, waiting in the shadows. A few minutes later, a sleek black sedan pulled up. A tall man in a sharp trench coat stepped out. He was a senior federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice, a man Victor had trusted with his life during his years in the bureau. I did not offer my hand to shake. I simply reached into my heavy jacket and pulled out a thick sealed envelope containing the forensic audit, the offshore bank statements, and the audio recordings of Derek and Melissa discussing their criminal enterprise. I handed it over to the federal prosecutor. Inside that envelope is the complete anatomy of a massive money laundering syndicate operating right under your nose, I said, my voice echoing off the concrete pillars. It implicates the executives of Lawson Construction, a prominent local doctor, and a sitting probate court judge. The prosecutor looked down at the heavy envelope and then back up at my face. "What do you want in return?" he asked, his tone strictly business. I looked him dead in the eyes. "I want full, unconditional federal immunity for myself," I stated firmly. "I want my name completely scrubbed from any impending indictments, and I want you to walk into Judge Caldwell's courtroom on Tuesday morning and arrest every single one of them in front of the entire world." The prosecutor opened the envelope, pulling out a small flashlight to scan the first few pages of the financial audit. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized the sheer scale of the corruption and the high-profile names involved. "This is a career-making bust," Victor whispered from behind me. "You protect him, and you get to take down a corrupt judge." The prosecutor nodded slowly, sliding the documents back into the envelope. "You have your immunity, Jim," he said softly. "I will see you in court on Tuesday." I returned to my dark and completely empty home just after midnight. The massive house was completely silent. Monday passed in a slow blur of agonizing anticipation. I continued to play the doddering old fool, stumbling through the hallways and staring blankly out the windows while my family finalized their plans to destroy my life. Monday night arrived. It was the final eve of the hearing. I was sitting in my heavy leather armchair in the living room, pretending to read a newspaper upside down. Cynthia walked into the room, her footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. She was carrying a very small silver tray with a steaming porcelain cup of chamomile tea. She smiled at me, a warm and loving expression that masked the soul of an absolute monster. "I made some tea to help you sleep, sweetheart," she cooed gently, setting the tray on the small table beside me. "You have a very big day tomorrow." I looked up at her, my hands trembling intentionally as I reached to touch the saucer. Through the reflection in the dark window pane across the room, I had just watched her slip a massive, crushing dose of liquid Xanax directly into the cup. She wanted to ensure I would look completely drugged, incoherent, and hopelessly incompetent for her bastard son to evaluate tomorrow. I smiled up at her, making sure the edges of my lips trembled just enough to convey the fragility she expected. "Thank you, Cynthia," I mumbled, taking the warm porcelain saucer from her hands. "You are always so good to me." The sheer hypocrisy of my words tasted far more bitter than the poison swirling inside the cup. She stood there for a moment, watching me intently. It was the look of a predator, making sure its prey had taken the bait. I brought the rim of the cup to my lips, blowing softly on the surface of the tea, and pretended to take a slow, deep sip. In reality, I kept my lips firmly pressed together, letting the warm liquid pool against my teeth before I silently swallowed nothing but air. Just as I lowered the cup, my burner phone, which I had carefully hidden under a magazine on the coffee table, let out a loud programmed notification chime. Cynthia jumped slightly, her eyes darting toward the sudden noise. "What was that?" she asked, turning her back to me for just a fraction of a second to inspect the coffee table. In that single fleeting moment of distraction, I tilted the teacup and poured the heavy dose of liquid Xanax directly into the dark soil of the large potted fern sitting beside my armchair. By the time she turned back around, the cup was nearly empty, resting casually on my knee. "Oh, it was just the television," I slurred, rubbing my eyes with the back of my hand. "I am feeling very tired all of a sudden." The medicine worked perfectly. I let my eyelids flutter and droop, slumping heavily against the leather cushions of the armchair. I made my breathing slow and ragged, mimicking the deep, unnatural slumber of a heavily sedated man. Cynthia stood over me for a long time. I could feel the heat of her gaze boring into my skin. She did not reach out to touch my face. She did not offer a blanket to keep me warm. She just watched the rise and fall of my chest with cold, clinical satisfaction. Her silence was louder than any scream. I let my jaw go slack, releasing a soft, rhythmic snore to completely seal the performance. Finally, I heard the soft click of her expensive heels turning away. She walked across the thick living room carpet and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the room in complete darkness. I remained perfectly motionless, fully aware that any sudden movement could ruin the entire trap. My muscles ached from the tension, but I forced my body to remain limp and unresponsive. The darkness of the living room felt heavy, suffocating, as if the walls of the massive house were slowly closing in around me. A few moments later, the faint sound of her dialing a phone reached my ears. I strained to listen, focusing all my attention on her muffled voice echoing from the distant kitchen. "Derek," she said, her tone sharp and completely devoid of the sweet affection she had shown me just minutes earlier. "Yes, it is done. The old dog is out cold in the living room. I gave him enough to knock out a horse. He will not even know his own name when the judge asks him tomorrow." I heard a faint, tinny laugh from the phone speaker. "Good," Derek replied. "The documents are fully prepped. Dr. Mitchell is ready to testify first thing in the morning. Tomorrow we take everything." Cynthia let out a soft sigh of absolute relief. "Make sure Melissa is dressed appropriately," she instructed him. "We need to look like a grieving, concerned family." I will see you at the courthouse." She ended the call and walked upstairs to our master bedroom, leaving me alone in the pitch-black living room. I lay there in the heavy silence, the leather chair feeling more like a coffin than a piece of furniture. The man who had walked into this house 54 years ago, filled with hope and dreams of building a beautiful family, was officially dead. The loving husband was gone. The devoted father who worked double shifts to pay for private schools and luxury vacations had been entirely erased from existence. All the warmth, all the compassion, all the blind loyalty I had carried in my heart for half a century had been violently hollowed out, replaced by a freezing, unforgiving void. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel sorrow. As I stared into the shadows of the room I had paid for with my own sweat, I realized I had crossed a permanent threshold. They had pushed me past the point of pain and directly into the realm of absolute retribution. The man sitting in the dark was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered. He was an executioner calmly waiting for the sun to rise so he could bring the blade down on their necks. Every breath I took in that dark room was measured steady and filled with a terrifying purpose. I spent the entire night wide awake rehearsing every single step of the devastation I was about to unleash. I imagined the looks on their faces. I imagined the exact moment their arrogant smiles would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The silence of the house was my only companion, a quiet witness to the birth of my vengeance. Morning finally arrived, casting a pale, cold light through the large windows. I maintained my sedated act as Derek and Melissa walked through the front door. Instead of greeting me, they forcefully grabbed my arms, dragging my limp body out of the chair and dropping me heavily into a rented metal wheelchair to make me look completely pathetic. They rolled me to the waiting car in silence. As we pulled up to the courthouse steps, Derek adjusted my blanket with a cruel smirk. "The trap is set," he whispered. The heavy oak doors of the probate court swung open. The room was cold, formal, and suffocatingly quiet. Derek and Melissa pushed my wheelchair down the center aisle. I kept my head bowed, playing the part of a broken, sedated old man. They parked me near the front defense table. Cynthia was already seated there, wearing a modest, dark dress that made her look like a grieving widow long before her husband was actually dead. She reached out and patted my hand, playing the role of the devoted wife for the bailiffs. I did not react. I just stared blankly at the polished wooden floor. At 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the courtroom to order. Everyone stood except for me. I remained slumped in my chair as Judge Thomas Caldwell swept into the room, his black robes billowing around him. He took his seat high up on the bench, looking down at us with a practiced expression of judicial neutrality that barely concealed his greedy anticipation. The proceedings began swiftly. Cynthia was called as the very first witness. She walked up to the stand with slow, deliberate steps. As she took the oath, her voice trembled beautifully. She spent 30 minutes painting a tragic, heartbreaking masterpiece of fiction. She told the court how my mental decline had accelerated over the past few months. She wiped away perfectly timed tears, describing how I would wander the house at night, forgetting the names of my own children, and making irrational, dangerous decisions regarding my business. "It has been absolutely devastating." "Your Honor," Cynthia sobbed, dabbing her eyes with a lace tissue. "Jim was such a brilliant, capable man. But the man sitting in that wheelchair is just a shell. He needs constant care, and our family just wants to protect him from himself." I listened to every single word, marveling at the sheer depth of her depravity. She was burying me alive, using my own supposed helplessness as the shovel. Next to take the stand was Dr. Warren Mitchell. He strode confidently to the witness box, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, projecting the absolute authority of a respected medical professional. He brought physical evidence with him. He placed a thick medical file on the railing and clipped a series of large, glossy brain scans onto the courtroom display board. "These are the results of Mr. Lawson's most recent magnetic resonance imaging," Mitchell explained, pointing a silver pen at the dark, cloudy shadows on the fake scans. As you can see here, there is severe irreversible shrinkage in the cerebral cortex. This is consistent with advanced rapid-onset dementia. The patient's cognitive functions have degraded to the point where he is entirely incapable of understanding complex financial matters, let alone operating a massive commercial construction firm. His condition is permanent. Your Honor, and it will only deteriorate further. It was pure, unadulterated perjury. Mitchell was committing a massive federal felony right in front of the judge, a judge who was fully complicit in the entire criminal conspiracy. I remained perfectly still in my wheelchair, breathing slowly, letting the sickening spectacle unfold exactly as we had anticipated. They were putting all their cards on the table, cementing their own legal doom, with every single syllable they spoke, into the official court record. Mitchell stepped down from the stand, offering Cynthia a solemn, sympathetic nod as he walked past her. Judge Caldwell looked down from his high bench, shuffling the fraudulent medical affidavits and the petition for involuntary conservatorship. He peered over the top of his reading glasses, fixing his gaze directly on me. There was no judicial impartiality in his eyes. There was only arrogant pity and cold, calculated greed. This was the man who had secretly fathered my eldest son. This was the man who was washing his dirty kickbacks through my company. And now he was about to sign the document that would hand my entire $22 million empire over to his bastard child. Mr. Lawson Caldwell said, his voice echoing loudly through the silent courtroom. "Can you hear me? Do you understand why you are here today?" I did not look up. I let my mouth hang slightly open, staring vacantly at my own knees. I allowed a faint tremor to shake my hand. Derek leaned down, pretending to comfort me, but whispered sharply into my ear. "Just keep your mouth shut, old man. It is almost over." Caldwell sighed heavily, shaking his head with a theatrical display of sorrow. "Let the record reflect that the patient is unresponsive and unable to comprehend the nature of these proceedings," the judge dictated to the court reporter. Based on the compelling and tragic testimony of his devoted wife and the conclusive medical evidence provided by Dr. Mitchell, it is the finding of this court that James Lawson is mentally incompetent. Caldwell picked up his heavy gold pen. He uncapped it slowly, savoring the moment. "I find that he is entirely incapable of managing his own affairs," the judge continued, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Therefore, I am granting the emergency petition for involuntary conservatorship. Full legal guardianship and complete financial power of attorney are hereby immediately transferred to his eldest son, Derek Lawson." I watched the golden tip of the pen hover just an inch above the final signature line of the legal decree. This was the exact moment they had meticulously planned for months. This was the singular stroke of ink that would officially strip away my fundamental human rights, drain my fortune, and lock me away in a miserable state-run nursing home until the day I died. Derek stood up slightly, his chest puffing out with victorious pride. Melissa smiled brightly from the gallery. Cynthia let out a long, shuddering breath of profound relief. They had won. The trap had snapped shut. Judge Caldwell reached for his heavy wooden gavel with his left hand, ready to strike the sounding block and seal my miserable fate forever. He lifted the gavel high into the air. The polished wood gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The room held its collective breath. But just as the gavel began its downward arc, the helpless, sedated old man in the metal wheelchair suddenly moved. I grabbed the cold armrests of the chair. With an explosive surge of strength that I had spent 54 years building on construction sites, I pushed myself up. I did not stumble. I did not shake. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, towering over the defense table. I locked my eyes directly onto Judge Thomas Caldwell. My gaze was razor-sharp, completely devoid of any confusion or fear. "Hold on, Your Honor," my voice boomed across the silent room, echoing off the walls with the thunderous authority of a man taking his life back. My memory just came back. The entire courtroom froze in absolute breathless shock. The heavy silence was shattered by the sharp gasp that escaped Cynthia's throat. She pressed both hands to her mouth, her perfectly practiced expression of grief melting into a mask of pure panic. The color drained from her face. Derek blinked rapidly, sitting right beside me. His brain completely short-circuited as he tried to process the impossible sight of the sedated old man standing tall and speaking with absolute clarity. The liquid Xanax was supposed to have rendered me virtually comatose. Instead, I was looking down at him, with eyes as cold and sharp as cracked glass. "Sit down, Dad," Derek hissed, panic lacing his tone as his true aggressive nature flared up. He stood up quickly, reaching out to grab my shoulders. He intended to forcefully push my frail body back down into the metal wheelchair before the judge could register what was happening. "You are having an episode," he commanded. "Sit down right now." He clamped his manicured hands onto my jacket, expecting me to crumble under his weight. But Derek had spent his entire life pushing papers and spending my money. I had spent 54 years hauling heavy steel, pouring cement, and breaking my back in the harsh elements. He fundamentally underestimated the physical strength of a man who built his life with his own two hands. As Derek pushed against my chest, I did not yield a single inch. I planted my heavy boots firmly on the polished wooden floor. I grabbed his wrists with my thick, calloused hands and squeezed. I squeezed until I felt the delicate bones in his arms grind against each other. Derek let out a sharp yelp of genuine pain. His eyes widened in absolute terror as he realized the sheer physical power I still possessed. With one swift, violent motion, I shoved him backward. He stumbled awkwardly over his own expensive leather shoes and crashed hard into the solid oak defense table. The impact knocked over a glass pitcher of water, sending it shattering to the floor. "Stay exactly where you are, boy," I growled, my voice low and dangerous enough to rattle the heavy wooden benches. "I am not having an episode. I have never been more lucid in my entire life." Melissa jumped to her feet, screaming for the bailiff, but the armed guards standing by the heavy doors did not move a single muscle. They were completely paralyzed by the sudden chaos, unsure of how to handle the miraculously cured ward of the state. Just as the courtroom erupted into a frenzy of murmurs and panicked shouts, the heavy double doors at the back of the room were kicked open with a resounding crash. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway was Benjamin Wright, flanked closely by Victor Thorne. They were not wearing the somber faces of legal defeat. They looked like hungry predators entering a feeding ground. Benjamin smoothly wheeled a large metal utility cart down the center aisle. It was loaded with massive cardboard boxes, overflowing with financial ledgers, bank records, and forensic audits. "I would like to file an emergency motion for absolute dismissal, Your Honor," Benjamin announced. His voice sliced through the noise like a razor blade. "And we are submitting immediate counterclaims of extreme financial fraud, elder abuse, and massive medical perjury." He parked the heavy metal cart right in the middle of the room, directly between my terrified family and the judge's elevated bench. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not pull out a handkerchief to wipe away fake tears. I pulled out a sleek black Bluetooth speaker and my secure mobile phone. I set the speaker down heavily on the defense table right in front of Cynthia. Her eyes were now wide with absolute horror. She slowly backed away from me, trembling violently, as if I were holding a live explosive device. "Let us listen to exactly how severe my mental decline truly is," I said, staring dead into her tear-filled eyes. I unlocked my phone, opened the encrypted application, and pressed play. The crisp digital audio filled the courtroom, amplified perfectly by the heavy acoustics of the large room. First came Derek's arrogant drawl, complaining loudly that I was living too long and controlling the company too tightly. Then came Melissa's whining voice, eagerly waiting for my old heart to finally give out so she could get her inheritance. The entire gallery gasped in collective shock. But the killing blow came when Cynthia's smooth, cold voice began speaking through the speaker. "I have been crushing mild prescription sedatives into his morning coffee. and his evening tea the recorded voice of my supposedly devoted wife confessed clearly to the entire court, just enough to slow his cognitive functions down. When the doctors examine him, the chemical residue will mimic the exact symptoms we need. The audio continued seamlessly, laying out their entire meticulous plot to secure the conservatorship, dump me in a miserable nursing home, and completely liquidate my $22 million firm. Cynthia collapsed back into her chair, covering her ears and weeping hysterically as her darkest secrets were broadcast to the world. Dr. Mitchell, sitting in the front row of the gallery, turned a sickening shade of gray. He realized his blatant medical perjury had just been completely exposed. Judge Thomas Caldwell hammered his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly against the sounding block. The loud, frantic cracks echoed like gunshots over the audio recording. His face was flushed a deep, angry crimson, and heavy beads of sweat were actively pouring down his forehead. "Turn that off!" Caldwell bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of judicial authority and sheer unrestrained panic. "This is an illegal wiretap. Turn it off or I will hold you in contempt." I calmly reached out, stopping the audio. I offered him a smirk. "Then let us talk about DNA, Your Honor." I reached into the top box on the metal utility cart and pulled out 3 thick manila folders. I walked right up to the heavy wooden railing that separated the gallery from the bench and tossed them onto the polished surface. The folders landed with a heavy, satisfying smack. Those contained the certified genetic profiles of the 3 strangers I was tricked into raising, I declared, my voice cutting through the thick tension of the room. I turned my gaze toward the gallery, locking eyes with the man in the front row. "Dr. Warren Mitchell," I called out, watching him physically shrink into his seat. "You were so desperate to hide the fact that you slept with my wife and fathered Bradley that you committed medical perjury right here in front of God and the entire legal system. You used my corporate health insurance to line your own pockets while pretending to be a family friend." The gallery gasped, several people turning to stare openly at the disgraced doctor. I did not stop there. I pivoted, pointing a hardened finger toward Melissa, who was shaking uncontrollably beside her mother. "And Melissa," I continued, my tone dripping with absolute disgust, "your biological father is not a doctor. He is a convicted felon named Gary Hobbs, a thieving subcontractor I personally sent to state prison 30 years ago for embezzling funds from my company. You are the spawn of a common thief, and you have been secretly siphoning my charity foundation to financially support him while living in the mansion I paid for." Melissa buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud, pathetic wail. The illusion of their high society grace was completely shattered, reduced to nothing but cheap infidelity and greed. Cynthia was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, completely paralyzed by the sheer precision of my vengeance. She had spent 54 years believing I was just a blind, obedient mule. She never imagined I was capable of dismantling her entire universe in a matter of minutes. Then I turned my attention away from the pathetic woman and her sobbing daughter. I slowly looked up at the elevated bench, locking my eyes directly onto Judge Thomas Caldwell. His face was a sickly shade of gray. He was gripping his wooden gavel so hard his knuckles were entirely white. He knew exactly what was coming, but he was completely powerless to stop it. I picked up the 3rd manila folder and held it up for everyone to see. "And finally, we have my arrogant eldest son, Derek," I announced, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that forced everyone in the room to lean forward. I stared right into Caldwell's terrified eyes. "Congratulations, Your Honor," I said, the words echoing loudly in the silent courtroom. "He is your bastard son." The courtroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. Reporters in the back rows scrambled for their phones. Spectators gasped and whispered furiously to one another. Derek stumbled backward, his face completely devoid of color, looking back and forth between his weeping mother and the disgraced judge sitting high on the bench. Cynthia let out a shrill, hysterical scream, begging me to stop talking. But I was just getting started. As the bailiff struggled to maintain order, Benjamin Wright stepped forward. He began pulling thick stacks of highlighted bank statements from the cardboard boxes, slapping them down onto the defense table for the official court reporter to log into the permanent record. Let us talk about why a sitting probate judge is so eager to declare a perfectly sane man legally incompetent, I projected over the noise of the chaotic room. It is not just about protecting his illegitimate child. It is about protecting his own dirty money. I grabbed a stack of offshore banking records and held them high in the air. For the past 7 years, Derek and Melissa have been operating a massive money laundering syndicate through my commercial construction firm. They have been inflating invoices and washing millions of dollars for local organized crime. And a massive portion of those cleaned funds did not stay offshore. They were routed through a series of complex shell companies directly into private accounts controlled by you, Judge Caldwell. The judge flinched as if he had been physically struck. You have been taking millions in illegal kickbacks from your own bastard son, I accused, stepping closer to the bench. You knew the federal authorities were closing in on the construction fraud. You needed a scapegoat. You needed to declare me mentally incompetent with rapid onset dementia so I would take the fall for your massive criminal enterprise when the federal indictments finally came down. You were going to steal my entire $22 million empire, lock me in a miserable state, run nursing home, and leave me to die behind bars to save your own corrupt skin. The evidence is all right here, meticulously documented by an independent forensic accountant. Every single wire transfer, every phantom invoice, every dirty dollar that found its way into your pockets is permanently recorded. You are not a judge. You are a common criminal hiding behind a black robe. Judge Caldwell leaped up from his heavy leather chair, his face contorted in a mask of sheer panic. He began wildly banging his wooden gavel against the sounding block, completely ignoring the fact that his authority was entirely destroyed. I declare a mistrial. Caldwell bellowed, his voice cracking hysterically over the deafening noise of the courtroom. This court is adjourned immediately. Clear the room. He threw the gavel down and frantically grabbed the edges of his black robes, turning swiftly to run toward the door leading to his private judicial chambers. He thought he could escape the consequences of his betrayal. He thought he could outrun the truth. But just as he took his first desperate step toward the exit, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst wide open again. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst wide open again, striking the paneled walls with a thunderous crash. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers stormed down the center aisle. Leading the charge was the tall prosecutor I had met in the underground garage just days before. He held federal arrest warrants high, his expression set in stone. Federal agents, he shouted, his voice echoing with absolute authority over the terrified screams of the gallery. Nobody move. The bailiffs immediately backed away, lowering their hands as the federal government seized control. Judge Caldwell froze in his tracks. 2 agents sprinted past the defense table, rushed up the wooden stairs, and grabbed the corrupt judge by his black robes. They yanked his arms behind his back, the heavy metallic click of the handcuffs echoing sharply. You have no jurisdiction here, Caldwell screamed, his face a mask of terror as he was dragged down from his bench. I am a sitting judge. The prosecutor calmly held a warrant directly in front of his sweating face. Not anymore, Thomas, the prosecutor replied coldly. You are under arrest for federal racketeering and money laundering. Across the room, 2 more agents cornered Dr. Mitchell. He dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands as agents clamped cold steel around his wrists. His spotless reputation and freedom were entirely gone. Then the agents turned to the heavy oak defense table. Derek tried to bolt, but an agent grabbed him by his tailored suit, slamming him face first into the wood. Melissa shrieked hysterically as a female agent pinned her against the railing, securing her wrists tightly. I stood perfectly still, watching the authorities dismantle the criminal syndicate masquerading as my own family. The prosecutor caught my eye and gave me a single affirming nod. Our late-night deal had paid off flawlessly. My name was completely scrubbed from the indictments. I had total federal immunity. I was just a tragic victim of their sophisticated embezzlement scheme. They were going to rot in federal prison, and I was walking out of the front doors a completely free man. Derek struggled uselessly against the agent holding him down. His face pressed painfully against the scattered financial ledgers proving his endless guilt. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with pathetic panic. "Dad, you have to stop this," Derek pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you gave me permission." I looked down at him, my expression entirely frozen. "You are not my son," I said softly. The illusion of their united, loving family did not even survive the first 10 seconds of their arrests. The sheer chaos of betrayal erupted. They instantly began to cannibalize each other to save their own pathetic skin. "It was his idea," Melissa screamed, pointing her shackled hands aggressively toward Derek. "I did not know about the money laundering." Derek forged the signatures. He violently forced me to do it. Derek twisted his head around his face, purple with rage. "Shut your mouth, you stupid thief," he bellowed back. "You were funneling cash to your deadbeat father for years before I ever touched the corporate accounts. You are just as guilty as I am." The federal agents roughly pulled them to their feet, desperate for a plea deal. Derek turned his treacherous eyes toward the only person at the defense table who was not wearing handcuffs. He looked directly at Cynthia. It was her, Derek shouted to the prosecutor, his voice echoing loudly. "My mother manipulated all of us. She has been drugging the old man for months. She planned the entire conservatorship fraud to keep the federal investigators away. She is the mastermind. Arrest her. Check her purse for the sedatives." Melissa immediately joined in, sobbing wildly. "Yes, it was our mother," she cried, nodding frantically. "She told us Jim was going to cut us out of the will. Please, I will testify against her. I will tell you everything she did." I stood there watching poetic justice unfold. The woman who had spent 54 years spinning a web of lies and raising a brood of selfish parasites was now being devoured by the monsters she had created. They had zero loyalty. There was no familial bond, no honor among them. At the first sign of real danger, her children threw her directly to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. They screamed her name, begging the federal agents to take her instead. The agents ignored their desperate pleas, marching Judge Caldwell, Dr. Mitchell, Derek, and Melissa down the aisle toward the heavy double doors. The spectators shrank back, watching the disgraced figures being paraded out. Caldwell kept his head down. Mitchell wept openly. But Derek and Melissa kept screaming their mother's name, their voices fading into the corridors as the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind them. The sudden silence that fell over the courtroom was deafening. The shocked bailiffs silently cleared the few remaining spectators. I now stood completely alone, listening to the faint, pathetic sound of someone weeping. I turned slowly. Cynthia was sitting completely alone at the defense table. The federal agents had intentionally left her completely untouched, because my extensive forensic audit proved beyond a doubt that she had zero involvement in the actual money laundering. Her crimes were entirely moral, not federal financial felonies. She was completely ruined in a way handcuffs could never accomplish. She slowly looked up at me, dark mascara running down her pale cheeks. Her lovers were going to prison. Her children were going to prison. She had absolutely nothing left in this entire world. She slid out of her chair and dropped heavily to the polished wooden floor. Trembling violently, she slowly began to crawl across the polished floor toward me, reaching out her shaking hands, desperately begging me for a shred of mercy. She reached my feet, her manicured fingers scrambling over the polished leather of my dress shoes. She gripped my ankles with a desperate, terrifying strength, burying her tear-stained face against my shins. "Jim, please," she sobbed, her voice a ragged, breathless wail that echoed off the empty wooden pews of the courtroom. "Please do not do this to me." 54 years, Jim. We built a life together for 54 years. You cannot just throw me away like this. I am your wife. I am the woman who stood by you. I am the mother of your children. You cannot leave me with absolutely nothing." I looked down at the pathetic figure trembling on the floor. Her expensive dark dress was wrinkled and covered in courtroom dust. The elegant, sophisticated matriarch of the Lawson family had been entirely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow shell. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and swollen silently, pleading for the kind, forgiving husband she had manipulated for over half a century. I was the provider, the protector, the man who would absorb every blow and still keep the house warm. "Jim, you have a good heart," she wept her tears, leaving dark, wet streaks across my shoes. "You are a good, honorable man. I made mistakes, I know I did, but I always loved you. I made sure you were taken care of. Please, Jim, I have nowhere to go. My children are gone. My life is ruined. Do not abandon me to the streets, I beg of you. Have mercy on your wife." She clung to my legs as if I were the last piece of driftwood in a raging ocean. The sheer audacity of her words was staggering. She was actually trying to weaponize my own honor against me. She was using the very virtues she had exploited for decades to try and save herself from the consequences of her own unimaginable betrayal. I watched her weep, analyzing the sound of her sobs. There was no genuine remorse in her voice. She was not crying because she had broken my heart or destroyed our family. She was crying because she had finally been caught. She was mourning the loss of her luxurious lifestyle, the unlimited bank accounts, and the comfortable safety net I had unknowingly provided. Her grief was entirely selfish. I let her cry for a long moment, allowing the heavy silence of the empty courtroom to amplify her pathetic wails. I wanted her to feel the absolute weight of her isolation. I wanted her to realize that the safety net was completely gone, cut to shreds by her own greedy hands. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not soften my gaze. I exercised absolute, unwavering, tough love. I planted my feet firmly, forcing her to look up into a face that held zero pity. "You have not been my wife since 1973. I said, my voice completely cold and detached, falling upon her like a heavy sheet of ice. "Do not ever use that word with me again. A wife is a partner. A wife is someone who builds a foundation based on trust and mutual respect. You were never my partner, Cynthia. You were a parasite. You infected my home, brought the offspring of thieves and corrupt men into my living room, and smiled at me every single morning while you slowly bled me dry." She gasped, shrinking back slightly, but her hands remained tightly gripped around my ankles. "But the years," she whimpered weakly. "The 54 years." I shook my head slowly. Those years were a business transaction. I corrected her, stripping away the last remaining illusion of our marriage. "I was just the guy paying the bills. I was the blind mule pulling the cart while you and your lovers rode in the back laughing at my stupidity. You used my sweat to buy your dresses. You used my broken bones to pay for your vacations. You used my love as a shield to hide your profound wickedness." I looked toward the heavy double doors where her children had just been dragged out in federal handcuffs. "And when the mule finally got too old and too tired to pull the cart fast enough, you decided to send him to the slaughterhouse." Her eyes widened in absolute terror as I threw her own plot directly back into her face. "You wanted me in a state-run nursing home," I continued, my voice echoing with righteous justice. "You wanted to drug me, strip away my human rights, and lock me in a sterile room smelling of bleach and boiled cabbage so you could liquidate my life's work. You thought I would just sit in a wheelchair and drool while you spent my $20 million. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers, forcing her to look into the eyes of the man she had completely underestimated. "Let us see exactly how you like it, Cynthia." She let go now, slumping completely onto the floor, as the freezing reality of my words paralyzed her. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single folded document. I dropped it onto the floor, right next to her trembling hands. "I filed for a fault-based divorce this morning," I informed her quietly. Because of your documented extreme infidelity and your active participation in severe medical and financial fraud, the penalty clauses in our marital agreements have been fully activated. The lawyers froze every joint account. You get absolutely zero, no alimony, no house, no settlement. I stepped back, freeing myself from her completely. I turned around and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bright sunlight. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, filling my lungs with fresh air for the first time in 50 years. The weeks that followed that explosive morning in probate court moved with a swift and brutal efficiency. The federal prosecutor kept his word. The evidence was so overwhelming that there was no need for a drawn-out trial. Derek and Melissa quickly realized they had no legal cards left to play. Their high-priced defense attorneys abandoned them when the funds dried up. During the depositions, they turned on each other with a viciousness that was difficult to even read about in the transcripts. They blamed each other for the forged signatures and the fake shell companies, but their frantic finger-pointing did not save them. The federal judge presiding over their criminal case, a stern man who deeply despised corporate corruption, showed them absolutely no mercy. He sentenced both of my former children to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. I simply did not attend their sentencing hearings. I literally did not want to see their faces ever again. I had already said my final goodbyes to the strangers I once called my children. Judge Thomas Caldwell suffered the most spectacular and public fall from grace the county had seen in decades. The state judicial board immediately stripped him of his robes, his title, and his lucrative government pension. Because he was a former magistrate who had put many dangerous men behind bars, placing him in a standard federal penitentiary was deemed a massive security risk. He was transferred to a specialized high-security facility in another state. He was locked in protective custody, forced to spend 23 hours a day, completely alone in a cold, concrete cell to ensure his own survival. His days of passing arrogant judgment on others were permanently over. Dr. Warren Mitchell faced a similar total destruction. The National Medical Board permanently revoked his license just days after his arrest. He was publicly disgraced, heavily fined by the insurance commissions, and his prestigious private clinic was seized by the federal government to help pay for the massive restitution he owed. He was sentenced to 7 years behind bars for widespread insurance fraud and blatant medical perjury. His medical degree was essentially reduced to a worthless piece of paper. The sophisticated multi-million-dollar empire of lies they had so carefully built together was reduced to absolute ash in a matter of weeks. The perpetrators were locked away in cages exactly where they belonged. Cynthia had managed to escape a federal criminal indictment, but she could not escape the absolute financial and social ruin she had so meticulously designed for herself. Without my steady income, and with her wealthy secret lovers locked away in prison cells, she was completely destitute. Our fault-based divorce proceeded with record speed. Because my lawyers presented irrefutable proof of her extreme infidelity and her complicity in the plot, the family court judge upheld the strictest penalty clauses of our marital agreements. She was awarded 0 alimony, 0 spousal support, and received absolutely no portion of my remaining clean assets. The massive, sprawling colonial estate in the upscale suburbs, the house she had filled with expensive imported furniture and deeply hollow memories, belonged entirely to me. Exactly 30 days after our explosive courtroom confrontation, I had my lawyers serve her with an official eviction notice. I hired a private security firm to stand in the grand marble foyer and watch her carefully pack a single suitcase with whatever clothes she could carry. She wept hysterically the entire time, begging the silent, stone-faced guards to let her speak to me just one last time. I was not there. I was sitting in my heavy truck parked down the street, watching her slowly walk out the front doors for the very last time. She had absolutely no friends left to call. The wealthy high society women from her exclusive country club completely shunned her the moment the scandalous news broke. Her children were locked away in federal cells and angrily refused to accept her collect calls, still bitterly blaming her for their complete downfall. With her bank accounts entirely frozen and absolutely nowhere else to go, the local state social services department had to step in and intervene. They quickly placed her in emergency subsidized housing. By a stroke of absolute beautiful poetic justice, the only facility in the county, with an open bed that accepted her state vouchers, was the Valley View Assisted Living Center. It was the exact same rundown, underfunded state-run nursing home she and Derek had originally selected to dump me in. I drove past the facility a few weeks later just to see it for myself. The long building was a depressing shade of gray, the front lawn was badly overgrown, and even from the street, the air around it smelled faintly of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage. The sophisticated woman who used to drink expensive red wine in a pristine kitchen was now eating cheap gelatin from a plastic cup in a loud, sterile cafeteria surrounded by confused strangers entirely forgotten by the world. She had dug a miserable, lonely grave for me, but she was the one who ultimately had to lie in it. With the toxic remnants of my past finally erased, I walked back into my home office and sat down at my heavy mahogany desk. I picked up my favorite pen and signed the final legal paperwork to officially liquidate Lawson Construction. The corporate entity was permanently dissolved, closing a painful chapter of my life forever. I opened the heavy leather binder containing the details of my newly established, irrevocable offshore trust. I stared at the balance printed at the bottom of the page. $15 million of clean, legally protected money. I ran my calloused fingers over the names of my loyal, blue-collar foremen listed as the primary beneficiaries. A deep, profound sense of peace finally settled over my tired soul. Now it was time to build my real family. 2 weeks after I signed the final dissolution papers for Lawson Construction, I rented out the entire county park on the edge of town. I hired the best caterers in the state, bringing in massive industrial smokers that filled the warm afternoon air with the rich, mouth-watering scent of hickory wood and slow-roasted brisket. I invited every single man and woman who had ever strapped on a hard hat, poured concrete, or driven a heavy rig for my company over the last 40 years. They showed up in droves, bringing their wives, their husbands, and their children. The park was alive with the sound of laughter, country music, and the clinking of cold glass bottles. I stood back near the edge of the wooden pavilion, watching the beautiful chaos unfold before me. These were the people who had truly built my empire. They were the ones who had frozen in the bitter winter winds and sweated through the brutal summer heat to make sure my business thrived. I waited until the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the long wooden picnic tables, before I finally picked up a microphone and asked for everyone's attention. The music faded out, and hundreds of faces turned to look at me. I cleared my throat, feeling a knot of emotion rise in my chest. For the past 54 years, I started my voice echoing slightly over the loudspeakers. I thought I was building a legacy for a family that shared my last name. But recent events have taught me a very harsh lesson about what the word family actually means in the real world. I looked out into the crowd and made direct eye contact with Hector, the loyal forklift driver who had endured Derek's endless abuse with quiet dignity. I saw my senior foreman, a man who had worked tirelessly by my side since we were both just kids mixing mortar in buckets. Family is not blood. I told them, my voice growing stronger and entirely steady. Blood is just biology. It is a random accident of birth. True family is loyalty. Family is the people who stand beside you when the foundation cracks. It is the people who bleed for you, who deeply respect your sacrifices, and who never treat you like a mindless beast of burden. I reached into the heavy leather satchel sitting on the picnic table right beside me. I pulled out a thick stack of sealed envelopes. When I closed the doors of Lawson Construction, I made sure that the real wealth of this company went exactly where it belonged, I announced proudly. I spent the next 2 hours personally handing out those envelopes. Inside each one was a certified check drawn directly from my new offshore trust. I gave Hector enough money to put all 3 of his daughters through college without taking out a single loan. I gave my senior foremen retirement bonuses that would allow them to pay off their mortgages tomorrow and never have to worry about a medical bill for the rest of their natural lives. I watched tough, hardened men guys who had never shed a tear in their entire lives break down and weep openly as they looked at the numbers printed on those slips of paper. They hugged me tightly. They shook my hand. They thanked me with a sincerity that completely repaired the broken pieces of my soul. I was giving away $15 million, but I had never felt richer in my entire life. A few days after the barbecue, I walked into a luxury dealership and bought a state-of-the-art recreational vehicle paid entirely in cash. It was a massive, beautiful machine, complete with a full modern kitchen, a plush leather living area, and a huge panoramic windshield that offered an unobstructed view of the world ahead. I packed my casual clothes, my favorite philosophy books, and a brand new set of high-end fishing gear. I did not leave a forwarding address for anyone to find me. I simply put the heavy vehicle in drive and pointed the grill toward the western horizon. Today, I am driving down a long, wide, open stretch of highway in northern Arizona. The vast sky above me is painted in brilliant shades of burnt orange and deep violet as the warm sun sets over the rugged desert landscape. I have the cruise control set, the large windows rolled down, and a classic rock station playing softly on the stereo. I reach into the small cooler beside the captain's chair and pull out an ice-cold beer. I pop the metal tab, take a long, deeply satisfying sip, and feel the cool desert wind rushing across my face. I am completely and utterly free. There are no parasites waiting for me back at a sprawling mansion. There are no entitled children demanding $50,000 checks for fake charity galas. There is no manipulative, cheating wife poisoning my coffee and plotting my legal demise in the shadows. There is only the steady hum of the engine, the vast, beautiful expanse of the open road, and the absolute peace of a man who finally took his own life back from the brink of total destruction. I lost 54 years to a deeply calculated lie. I gave my youth, my health, and my blind trust to people who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable bank account. But I will be damned if I lose one more single day to regret or sorrow. I am 71 years old, and my real life is just beginning right now. I am going to see every beautiful national park, fish every single river, and spend my remaining time on this earth exactly how I want to, answering to absolutely no one but myself. If you are listening to this story right now, and you feel a familiar ache in your chest, I want you to pay very close attention to my next words. If you are being used by the people who falsely claim to love you, if you are being treated like a walking ATM, or if you are being slowly drained of your spirit by toxic family members, you need to stand up. Do not let them convince you that enduring their abuse is your noble duty. Fight back with everything you have. Protect your peace, secure your foundation, and cut the dead weight loose before it drags you completely under the water. You deserve to be respected, and you deserve to be free. Do you think I was too harsh on Cynthia by taking everything and leaving her in that miserable nursing home? Or did she get exactly what she rightfully deserved after half a century of lies and betrayal? I want to read your thoughts, so let me know down in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. I will see you in the next life story.